Lieutenant Marcus Chen would have rolled his eyes at the Valaxian doctor's condescending tone, but even that simple motion hurt too much. Instead, he lay still on the medical bed, pretending to be fascinated by the pulsing, bioluminescent ceiling of the recovery ward aboard Nexus 7. "Remarkable how your species manages to survive at all," Dr. Zixatal commented, his 4 arms simultaneously adjusting various medical devices. The crystalline ridges along his forehead sparkled under the ambient light, a physiological sign of amusement among Valaxians. 3 fractured ribs, a punctured lung, and multiple torn ligaments. A Valaxian would have simply grown replacements within hours. "Well, we can't all be walking regeneration machines," Marcus replied, watching the doctor's ridges sparkle even brighter at his response. The medical ward of Nexus 7 space station was filled with the soft hum of advanced alien technology that, despite its sophistication, couldn't speed up human healing any more than traditional methods. Another Valaxian nurse, Kelvor, glided into the room on her gravity-defying mobility disc. "Doctor, the human's vital signs are showing unusual fluctuations again. Perhaps we should consider transferring him to a more primitive facility better suited to their medical capabilities?" Marcus caught the barely concealed disdain in her voice. The Valaxians had been the galaxy's premier medical experts for centuries, and their own naturally resilient biology had led them to view other species, particularly humans, as hopelessly fragile. "That won't be necessary," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "I'm perfectly fine with your advanced and clearly superior medical care." The sarcasm in his voice went completely over their crystalline heads. Dr. Zixatal made a sound that might have been a chuckle, though it sounded more like wind chimes in a blender. "Your species' determination is admirable, if misplaced. Did you know that humans are one of only 3 known species that lack any form of natural regeneration? Even your bones heal at a glacial pace." "Fascinating," Marcus muttered, watching as a medical drone buzzed around his bed, its sensors scanning his supposedly inferior human body for the 1,000th time that day. The doctor continued his lecture, clearly enjoying the opportunity to educate a member of such a primitive species. "Your cardiovascular system is remarkably inefficient. Your skeletal structure is far too rigid, and your neural pathways—" He shook his head, causing light to dance off his crystalline features. "It's truly a wonder your kind made it to space at all." A group of Valaxian medical students floated by the observation window, their ridges sparkling with enthusiasm as they noticed the human patient. Marcus had become something of an attraction in the ward, a living example of evolutionary inadequacy for the aspiring doctors to study. "And yet," Marcus said, shifting slightly to face the doctor, "here I am sharing the same space station as you fine folks. Must be pretty embarrassing to have such an inferior species as neighbors." The doctor missed the sarcasm entirely. "Oh, not at all. We find your species' persistence, despite your limitations, to be quite charming. It's like watching a planetary rover continue to function long past its expected operational life, inspiring in a quaint sort of way." Marcus closed his eyes, wondering if he could convince the medical drone to accidentally sedate him. The constant reminders of human frailty were becoming more exhausting than his actual injuries. "Rest now," Dr. Zixatal said, his tone dripping with patronizing kindness. "Your primitive healing processes require extended periods of inactivity, though I must say your ability to survive despite such inefficient recovery methods is rather remarkable. Perhaps we should write a paper about it." As the doctor and nurse glided away, Marcus could hear them discussing the possibility of using his case as a teaching example of evolutionary dead ends that somehow achieve spacefaring status. He let out a careful sigh, mindful of his healing ribs. Being confined to a Valaxian medical ward was proving to be more challenging than the training accident that put him there in the first place. The bioluminescent ceiling continued its soothing pulse, and Marcus found himself wondering if the Valaxians' supposedly superior biology came with an equally advanced sense of irony. Somehow, he doubted it. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a slight temperature change, something that Marcus's supposedly inferior human nervous system detected before the Valaxians' environmental sensors caught it. He watched with mild amusement as Dr. Zixatal continued his morning rounds, completely oblivious to the growing warmth in the medical ward. "Your cellular regeneration rate has increased by 0.3%, the doctor announced proudly, as if he'd personally upgraded Marcus's biology. At this rate, you might be fully recovered in mere weeks rather than the expected months." The congratulatory speech was interrupted by a sudden flicker of the bioluminescent ceiling, followed by an emergency announcement in multiple languages. "Warning: environmental control anomaly detected in sectors 7 through 12. Technical teams have been notified." Dr. Zixatal's crystalline ridges dulled slightly, a sign of concern. "How curious. Our systems are typically quite reliable." Marcus pushed himself up on his elbows, ignoring the protest from his healing ribs. "Typically? When was the last time you had a system-wide diagnostic?" "Oh, we hardly need those," the doctor replied, waving two of his forearms dismissively. "Valaxian technology is self-maintaining. Unlike human systems, it doesn't require constant—" The lights flickered again, and this time the temperature jumped several degrees higher. A new alarm joined the first, its urgent tone drawing worried looks from the medical staff. "Alert! Life support systems showing critical pressure variations in maintenance tunnels. Access to control junctions required for manual override." The ward erupted into controlled chaos as Valaxian medical staff coordinated with station engineers. Marcus observed their mounting frustration as reports came in from different sectors. The maintenance tunnels, designed primarily by human engineers years before the Valaxians took over the medical facility, were proving problematic. "What do you mean you can't access Junction C-17? Dr. Zixatal demanded into his communication device. "Surely our environmental suits can—" "Ah, I see." He turned to address the growing crowd of concerned staff members. "The maintenance tunnels are experiencing severe gravitational fluctuations. Our mobility discs cannot function in such conditions, and the passage dimensions are—" He paused, his ridges dimming further, "optimized for human proportions." Marcus couldn't help himself. "You mean they're too small for your superior Valaxian physiology?" Before the doctor could respond, the entire station shuddered. The emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in a red glow that made the Valaxians' crystalline features look almost menacing. "Station core temperature rising," the automated system announced. "Critical failure predicted in 47 minutes without manual intervention." "Can't you send in maintenance drones?" Marcus asked, watching as the medical staff's usual composure began to crack. Kelvor, the nurse, shook her head. "The gravitational disturbances are disrupting their navigation systems. We need direct physical access to reset the primary control nodes, but the tunnels—" She gestured helplessly with all four arms. Marcus did some quick mental calculations. The maintenance tunnels had been designed by humans for humans back when Nexus 7 was first constructed. Even with his injuries, he might be able to— "I could do it," he said, already swinging his legs over the side of the bed. The medical staff turned to stare at him, as if he'd suggested solving the problem through interpretive dance. Dr. Zixatal's ridges practically stopped glowing altogether. "Absolutely not," the doctor declared. "In your condition, any strenuous activity could reverse weeks of healing. The physical stress alone would be—" Another violent shudder ran through the station. The temperature was now high enough that even the Valaxians were showing signs of discomfort. 39 minutes to critical failure, the system helpfully announced. "Look," Marcus said, carefully standing up, "you can either let me try, or we can all wait here and see if your superior biology can handle a complete life support failure." He paused for effect. "Though I suppose you could always just regenerate new lungs when these ones freeze, boil, or decompress, whatever comes first." The Valaxian medical staff exchanged glances, their crystalline features reflecting the red emergency lighting, in a dance of uncertainty. Finally, Dr. Zixatal's ridges flickered in resignation. "The tunnel entrance to Junction C-17 is 3 levels down," he said, reaching for a medical scanner. "But you should know that the gravitational fluctuations will make movement extremely difficult, especially with your injuries. The human body simply isn't designed to adapt to changing circumstances," Marcus finished for him, accepting a maintenance toolkit from one of the engineers. "Funny thing about us humans, we have a long history of doing things our bodies weren't designed for. It's kind of our specialty." As if to emphasize the point, another tremor shook the station. Marcus grimaced as he took his first steps toward the ward exit, his body protesting every movement. Behind him, he could hear Dr. Zixatal instructing his staff to prepare for a probable emergency surgery when, not if, Their fragile human patient returned with even more injuries. 28 minutes to critical failure, the system announced, its artificial voice somehow managing to sound both helpful and doom-laden at the same time. Marcus allowed himself a small smile as he approached the maintenance access hatch. "Well," he muttered under his breath, "at least no one will have to write a paper about how humans handle pressure situations. We'll either survive this or there won't be anyone left to peer review it." The maintenance tunnel felt like it was actively trying to kill Marcus, which, given recent developments, might not have been far from the truth. He pressed forward through another section of shifting gravity, his broken ribs screaming in protest as he pulled himself along the guideline. "We're detecting increased radiation levels in your sector," Dr. Zixatal's voice crackled through the communicator. "The shielding appears to be failing. Perhaps we should reconsider." "Little busy right now, Doc," Marcus grunted, pushing off from one wall as the gravity shifted again. The motion sent a fresh wave of pain through his chest, but he kept moving. "Any chance you could focus on something more helpful, like why half the station's systems are going haywire?" A new voice joined the channel, Chief Engineer Vexner, her usual crystalline timbre tight with concern. "Lieutenant Chen, we've detected unauthorized access codes in the system. These failures aren't random. Someone or something is deliberately sabotaging the station." "Fantastic," Marcus muttered, pausing at a junction to check his bearings. "Any idea who our mystery guest might be?" The answer came in the form of a sudden power surge that sent arcs of electricity dancing across the tunnel walls. Marcus barely managed to dodge behind a support beam as a section of paneling exploded nearby. "The coding signature matches known Drachnid infiltration patterns," Vexner reported grimly. "They must have planted sleeper programs during the last maintenance cycle." Marcus remembered the Drachnids, a species renowned for their technological prowess and their intense rivalry with the Valaxians. Their crystalline biology was similar, but where Valaxians focused on medical advancement, Drachnids specialized in weapons development. The two species had been locked in a cold war for centuries. "Wonderful," he said, forcing himself to keep moving despite the growing pain in his chest. "I don't suppose they left an instruction manual for their sabotage program?" "This is hardly the time for human humor," Dr. Zixatal interjected. "Your vital signs are becoming erratic, and the radiation levels are—" Another surge rocked the tunnel, this one strong enough to temporarily nullify the artificial gravity. Marcus found himself floating, surrounded by debris from the damaged panels. A piece of metal grazed his arm, adding a fresh cut to his collection of injuries. 15 minutes to critical failure, the station's AI announced cheerfully. Radiation containment at 60% and falling. Marcus used the zero-G moment to his advantage, pushing off the ceiling towards the next junction. His training kicked in, remembering countless hours in simulation chambers. The Valaxians might consider human space adaptation crude, but right now those crude skills were keeping him alive. "Lieutenant," Vexena's voice returned, "we've identified the source of the sabotage. The Drachnids placed a quantum override device in junction C19. It's 2 sections past your current position." "Of course it is," Marcus wheezed, fighting against another gravity shift that tried to slam him into the wall. "Because C17 wasn't far enough through this maze of death." The radiation warning on his environment suit's display was climbing steadily. The Valaxians' superior biology might handle radiation better than humans, but their larger size made these tunnels practically impossible for them to navigate. Their crystalline forms would shatter, trying to make the tight turns Marcus was barely managing with his injuries. "We're reading a significant drop in your oxygen saturation," Dr. Zixatal reported, his tone a mixture of professional concern and growing amazement. "By all medical logic, you should be unconscious by now." "Thanks for the vote of confidence, Doc." Marcus pulled himself around a corner using minimal movements to avoid stressing his ribs further. But humans have this annoying habit of ignoring medical logic when necessary. The next section of tunnel was partially collapsed, leaving a gap barely wide enough to squeeze through. Marcus could hear the Valaxian medical staff discussing the impossibility of the situation as he assessed the opening. "Even if you reach the device," one of them argued, "the radiation exposure required to disable it would cause severe cellular damage. The human body cannot withstand." Marcus cut them off by muting his communicator. He needed to focus, and a lecture on human biological limitations wasn't helping. The gap in the tunnel would require him to twist sideways, a movement guaranteed to put massive stress on his injured ribs and lung. 10 minutes to critical failure, the AI reminded everyone, its tone still inappropriately chipper. With a grunt that was part pain and part determination, Marcus began squeezing through the gap. Each movement sent fresh waves of agony through his chest, but he kept going. The Valaxian medical staff had plenty of data on human physical limitations. He'd been their living textbook example for weeks. What they didn't have data on was human stubbornness. He emerged on the other side to find the tunnel bathed in the red glow of warning lights. His suit's radiation detector was now screaming at him, matching the screaming of his own muscles. Reactivating his communicator, Marcus was greeted by a chorus of Valaxian voices, expressing various levels of disbelief at his vital signs. "Impossible," one of the medical students was saying. "The human pain threshold should have been exceeded several minutes ago." "Perhaps our baseline data was incomplete," another suggested. "We may need to revise our studies on human endurance limits." "If you're all done updating your research papers," Marcus interrupted, spotting a faint blue glow ahead that had to be the Drachnid device, "I could use some instructions on how to disable an alien quantum override without, making everything worse." There was a pause before Chief Engineer Vexena responded, her voice carrying an unmistakable note of respect. "We're sending the shutdown sequence now. Lieutenant Chen, your species continues to surprise us." "That's what we're here for," Marcus replied, dragging himself toward the device. "Someone has to keep you folks updating your medical journals." The Drachnid device pulsed malevolently as he approached, its crystalline structure similar to Valaxian technology, but twisted into something darker. As Marcus reached for it, he could hear Dr. Zixatal beginning what sounded suspiciously like preliminary notes for a new paper on human physiological capabilities under extreme conditions. Some things, it seemed, never changed, even in the face of imminent disaster. The Drachnid device sparked and died under Marcus's hands, but the station's AI chose that moment to deliver more bad news. "Warning, reactor core containment protocols failing, catastrophic meltdown imminent in 7 minutes. "You have got to be kidding me," Marcus wheezed, each breath feeling like someone was stabbing his chest with a hot poker. "Let me guess, the reactor controls are in another maintenance tunnel." "Worse," Chief Engineer Vexena responded. "The sabotage program has locked down the reactor room itself. The emergency override is inside, but the radiation levels," she trailed off, "are at levels that would crystallize Valaxian biology in seconds," Dr. Zixatal finished. "Even with our regenerative capabilities, the exposure would be fatal." Marcus checked his suit's radiation counter, which had given up displaying numbers and was now just showing a red warning symbol. "And what about human biology?" The silence on the comm channel was telling. "Right," Marcus pushed himself up, using the wall for support. "How do I get there?" "Lieutenant Chen," Dr. Zixatal's voice carried genuine concern now, not just clinical interest. "Your body has already endured more trauma than our medical models indicated possible. The radiation in the reactor room would cause immediate cellular damage. Your species lacks the regenerative capabilities to—" "Time to critical meltdown, 6 minutes," the AI helpfully interrupted. Marcus started moving, following the emergency lighting toward the reactor section. "Doc, remember how humans made it to space despite our inferior biology? We didn't do it by listening to people tell us what we couldn't survive." His injured lung chose that moment to remind him of its presence with the stabbing pain that nearly dropped him to his knees. The medical readouts must have shown the spike in distress because the comm channel erupted with concerned Valaxian voices. "Your lung function is decreasing rapidly," one of the medical staff reported. "The physical strain is causing the injury to worsen." "Internal bleeding has resumed," another added. "Cellular damage is accelerating beyond sustainable levels." Marcus kept moving, forcing each step through sheer willpower. "You know what humans did before we had fancy medical scanners? We ignored the pain and did what needed to be done anyway." He reached the reactor room's outer door, his vision blurring around the edges. The radiation warning symbols covered nearly every surface, glowing an angry red in the emergency lighting. 4 minutes to critical meltdown. The door's emergency release was a simple mechanical lever, another primitive human design element that was proving its worth. Marcus pulled it, and the heavy shield swung open with a hiss of escaping air. "Lieutenant," Vexana's voice was urgent now, "the override sequence requires maintaining physical contact with the control panel for at least 2 minutes while the system resets. In that radiation... Better start timing then, Marcus said, stepping into the reactor room. The radiation hit him like a physical wave, his suit's protection systems overwhelmed almost instantly. The control panel was on the far wall, next to the pulsing core itself. Each step felt like walking through molten lead, his muscles screaming in protest. The partially healed injuries from the training accident were nothing compared to what his body was experiencing now. Extraordinary, one of the medical staff muttered, probably not intending to broadcast. His pain receptors should have shut down completely by now, yet he's still moving. Marcus reached the panel, his hands shaking as he input the override sequence. The screen flashed red, demanding continuous authentication. He pressed his palm against the sensor pad, gritting his teeth against the burning sensation that shot up his arm. 3 minutes to critical meltdown. The human nervous system wasn't designed for this level of stress, Dr. Zixatal was saying, his clinical tone giving way to something like awe. Yet somehow... Doc, Marcus interrupted, his voice rough. Remember when you said humans were like rovers operating past their expiration date? He coughed, tasting copper. Sometimes outdated equipment just refuses to quit. The reactor's angry pulsing began to slow as the override sequence progressed. Marcus focused on the countdown on the screen, using it to measure his breaths against the pain. 120 seconds had never felt so long. Cellular degradation reaching critical levels, someone reported. Major organ systems showing signs of failure. Fascinating, another voice added. Despite the physical deterioration, cognitive functions remain intact. The sheer determination required to... 2 minutes to critical meltdown. Marcus leaned against the control panel, his legs threatening to give out. The room was spinning, but he kept his hand pressed firmly against the sensor. He thought about all the times the Valaxians had documented human weakness, catalogued human frailty, studied human limitations. You know what's really remarkable about humans, Doc? He managed between ragged breaths. We're really bad at accepting limitations, especially other people's opinions of our limitations. The override sequence reached 90%. Marcus's vision had narrowed to a tunnel focused solely on the progress bar. His body was simultaneously on fire and numb, but his hand remained steady on the panel through what the Valaxians would later describe as sheer impossible stubbornness. 1 minute to critical meltdown. The reactor core pulsed one final time before settling into its normal operational rhythm. Throughout Nexus 7, emergency lights switched back to standard illumination as systems returned to normal. In the reactor room, Marcus finally allowed his hand to slip from the control panel as his legs gave out. Reactor stabilized, critical meltdown averted, have a nice day, the AI announced, somehow managing to sound smug. The medical response team found him propped against the reactor housing, conscious but barely. The Valaxians, encased in their heaviest radiation suits, moved with an efficiency that seemed almost frantic, at least by their crystalline standards. I think I might need that emergency surgery now, Doc, Marcus mumbled as they loaded him onto a hover stretcher. Unless your superior biology has some tips for radiation poisoning. Dr. Zixatal's crystalline features were unreadable behind his protective suit, but his voice carried an unfamiliar tone, something between respect and bewilderment. Lieutenant Chen, I believe we may need to rewrite several chapters of our xenobiology text after today. 3 weeks later, Marcus awoke in the medical ward to find the ceiling had stopped its annoying bioluminescent pulse. Instead, it displayed a gentle pattern that reminded him of Earth's aurora borealis. He turned his head, noting with satisfaction that it no longer felt like it was filled with razor blades, to see Dr. Zixatal reviewing medical data with a group of students. The human capacity to endure what their biology suggests is impossible presents a fascinating paradox, the doctor was saying. Traditional Valaxian medical theory focuses on physiological capabilities, yet Lieutenant Chen's actions demonstrate that consciousness, determination, and what humans call willpower can override seemingly absolute physical limitations. But how do we quantify such factors? One student asked, their ridges glowing with curiosity. Perhaps, Marcus called out, his voice rough but steady, you could start by not trying to quantify everything. The group turned, ridges flickering in surprise at finding him awake. Dr. Zixatal approached the bed, his usual air of superiority replaced by something that looked suspiciously like genuine interest. "Lieutenant, your recovery continues to defy our medical models. We've had to establish entirely new protocols for human treatment based on your case." "Glad to help advance medical science," Marcus replied. "Though next time, maybe we could find a less dramatic way to do it." The doctor's ridges sparkled, but this time it wasn't condescending amusement. "The station council has been quite interested in our findings. They've approved a joint human-Valaxian medical research initiative. It seems your species has more to teach us than we previously assumed. We're particularly interested in the psychological aspects of human resilience," one of the students added eagerly. "The ability to continue functioning despite clear biological indicators of failure is remarkable." Marcus couldn't help but smile. "You know what humans call that? Being stubborn." "A crude but perhaps accurate term," Dr. Zixatal acknowledged. "We've also had to revise our emergency protocols. The Drachnid sabotage exposed several vulnerabilities in our station design. The Council has recommended incorporating more human elements into future constructions." "You mean you're going to add more cramped maintenance tunnels?" "Among other things," the doctor replied. "Your species' tendency to build redundant mechanical systems that don't rely on advanced technology proved quite valuable, as did your physical adaptability to varying environmental conditions." A new voice joined the conversation as Chief Engineer Vexena entered the ward. Her crystalline features had been modified with what appeared to be more flexible joint structures, an unusual sight for a Valaxian. "The Council approved my design modifications," she announced. "We're implementing human-inspired adaptations to our environmental suits. Apparently, there's something to be said for being able to crawl through maintenance tunnels." "Next, you'll be telling me you're installing manual door releases everywhere," Marcus quipped. "Actually, yes," Vexena replied seriously, "along with several other primitive but effective backup systems." Dr. Zixatal made an adjustment to Marcus's medical monitors. "It seems we had become overly reliant on our natural advantages. Your actions demonstrated that there are many forms of resilience, not all of them biological. The Medical Council is particularly interested in studying human pain tolerance and stress response," one of the students added, "though perhaps with less life-threatening research methods." "Appreciate that," Marcus said, attempting to sit up. This time both the doctor and nurse moved to assist him, rather than lecture him about his biological limitations. "We've also recommended changes to our first contact protocols," Dr. Zixatal continued. "Perhaps measuring a species' advancement solely by their biological capabilities was short-sighted." The ward's entrance slid open, revealing a mix of human and Valaxian engineers discussing station modifications. The humans moved with their usual efficiency while the Valaxians observed with newfound appreciation rather than their previous condescension. "You know," Marcus observed, watching the two species work together, "there's an old human saying, necessity is the mother of invention. When you don't have natural advantages, you learn to work around them." Dr. Zixatal's ridges pulsed thoughtfully. "Perhaps that is your species' greatest strength, not the ability to survive despite your limitations, but the creativity to transform those limitations into advantages." "That," Marcus replied with a grin, "and being too stubborn to know when we're supposed to fail." The doctor's crystalline features sparkled with genuine amusement. "Indeed, though perhaps we should find less destructive ways to demonstrate that particular trait in the future." "No promises, Doc, no promises at all."